Dawn had not yet broken over the Rhineland. A low mist, smelling of damp earth and cold river, clung to the valleys, rendering the world a study in monochrome. Silhouettes of factory chimneys stood sentinel against a steel-gray sky, their bricks still holding the night's chill, their furnaces silent. This was a land asleep, or perhaps holding its breath. The camera's eye, disembodied and patient, glided northward over patchwork fields separated by dark bands of ancient forest. These woods were the true borders, more palpable than any surveyed line, dividing a quilt of petty principalities, bishoprics, and duchies. The invisible walls of custom and tradition were as real as stone. The journey ended in a still, wood-paneled chamber in Frankfurt. Heavy drapes, the color of dried blood, were partially drawn. A single shaft of sunlight, thick and tangible with swirling dust motes, cut through the gloom to fall upon a massive oak table. Upon it lay a large, carefully unrolled German Confederation. The parchment was creamy and worn at the edges, its inks a faded tapestry of borders and names. The air was cold, carrying the faint, sweet scent of old paper, sealing wax and polished wood. No fire crackled in the grate, no breath stirred the motes in their slow, eternal dance. Gilt frames, holding portraits of forgotten men, gleamed dully in the shadows. The silence was not peaceful but expectant, like the pause between a drawn breath and a spoken word. The palette of the room was one of muted authority. Prussian blues in the carpet's pattern, deep forest greens in the velvet chair upholstery, the dull gold of ornamentation awaiting a hand to bring it to life. Here in this empty hall, the idea of a nation existed only as lines on paper and dust in the light. From the dusty silence of consensus, the focus sharpened to the contrasting hearts where will was crystallized into action. First, Berlin. A flat, featureless gray sky pressed down upon the city, a lid on. A crucible, the camera traveled down a wide, empty boulevard, the untered den Linden stripped of life and leaves. The buildings lining it were severe blocks of granite and sandstone, their neoclassical facades sharp, unadorned, and imposing. Every column, every cornice spoke of disciplined order, a geometry imposed upon the sand of the Brandenburg Plain. The air was crisp, cold, and carried a distant metallic tang from the slow waters of the river Spree. Then a dissolve into Baroque opulence. The scene transitioned to a gilded, empty hallway in the Hofburg Palace, Vienna. Here, power was soft, layered, and ancient. The camera navigated past walls smothered in intricate stucco scrollwork and faded tapestries depicting mythological triumphs. Light from crystal sconces cast a warm, honeyed glow over everything, yet the space felt heavy, saturated with centuries of whispered intrigue. The air smelled of beeswax polish and stale perfume, a cloying scent of preserved grandeur. The final focus was a Berlin study at night. A heavy oak desk, its surface bare save for a single document weighted by a paper knife, sat under the precise, green-shaded glow of a lamp. In the corner, a white porcelain stove stood cold and silent. The room was a cell of concentration, every object purposeful and austere. The silence here was not the expectant silence of Frankfurt, nor the drowsy silence of Vienna. It was the absolute, ringing silence of a decision already made, hanging in the air like a suspended blade, awaiting only the moment of its fall. The abstract tensions of council chambers and studies found their physical translation in landscapes scoured by conflict. First, the wind-blasted dunes of Schleswig. A cold, salt-laden fog shrouded the coast, muting the world to shades of washed-out gray and dull ochre. The camera moved over sand sculpted into harsh geometric shapes, abandoned earthworks, now slumped and eroding. A single muzzle-loading cannon, its iron barrel cold to the touch, tilted at a forlorn angle in the sand, half buried like the skeleton of some leviathan. Beyond the North Sea was a sheet of leaden gray, merging seamlessly with the mist. The only sound was the constant, sighing wind which had already begun to smooth the sharp edges of the recent past. From the coastal silence, the perspective followed a pair of railway tracks. They gleamed dully under a weak, diffused sun, cutting a relentless straight line through a pine forest. The trees stood in silent, dark ranks, their needles damp. The tracks led to a vast, empty marshalling yard on the outskirts of a nameless town. Here, order was industrial and profound. Rows of steam locomotives sat silent on parallel tracks, their great iron wheels stationary, their cowcatchers poised for journeys not yet begun. Tendrils of morning mist curled around their frames and pooled between the rails. The yard was a monument to logistical potential, a nervous system awaiting the signal to animate its cold iron body. The final transition was to the rolling, wooded hills of Bohemia in the spectral quiet after Königgrätz. The ground was a churned morass of thick, clay-heavy mud, deeply scarred by the passage of countless cannon wheels and booted feet. The violence had moved on, leaving behind only its footprints, shattered branches hanging from oaks, swathes of grass trampled into the earth, a single discarded canteen already rusting. A low, clinging mist filled the valleys, softening the contours of the ravaged land. The air was still and damp, carrying the rich, pungent scent of wet soil and bruised greenery. The only sound was the intermittent, lonely drip of condensed moisture from the leaves of the surviving trees, a slow, metronomic punctuation to the silence of aftermath. Inside the Krupp works in Essen, the scale of the enterprise was a physical weight. The forge was a cavernous cathedral to industry, silent and freezing. Light from high, grime-caked windows fell in dusty shafts. illuminating the floating moats of iron and coal. The machinery stood in monstrous ranks, cold hammer presses with jaws capable of shaping molten steel, lathes with beds longer than freight cars, overhead cranes frozen on their rails. Their surfaces were dark with oil and soot, their immense power latent, coiled within cold iron and silent hydraulics. The air smelled of metal, cold grease, and old ash. The silence was not peaceful, but charged, as if the machines were merely sleeping, dreaming of the rhythmic thunder they would produce. The perspective shifted across a continent, to the outskirts of Paris in the dead of winter. The camera looked down a grand, deserted boulevard, its perspective stretching toward the city's heart. The trees lining it were skeletal, their leafless black branches etched against a flat, pale sky. A hard frost sheened the cobblestones and clung to the ornate wrought-iron balconies of the apartments. Far in the distance, barely visible through the crystalline haze of the morning, stood the geometric silhouettes of the Prussian siege guns. They were dark, angular shapes arranged with mathematical precision on the frozen fields, their long barrels pointing inward like accusatory fingers. The buildings showed no scars, their elegant facades intact, yet the absolute absence of life was more chilling than any ruin. No carriage rattled, no shutter opened, no smoke curled from a chimney. The palette was stark and merciless, the blinding white of frost, the black of branches and iron, the dull, cold gray of stone and waiting sky. It was a tableau of siege, not of violence, but of immense, patient pressure, where the machinery of war had become a landscape feature, and the city held its breath beneath its guns. The camera began its ascent at the garden doors, a slow, sweeping crane shot that floated into the utterly empty, vast expanse of the Hall of Mirrors. The parquet floor, a geometric masterpiece of polished oak, stretched in seeming infinity, each panel perfectly duplicated in the long procession of mirrored arches lining the opposite wall. The space was flooded with a cold, clear winter light pouring through the 17 tall windows overlooking the formal gardens. This merciless illumination made the gilded statues lining the cornices blaze with a hard, metallic fire, and set the countless crystals of the chandeliers ablaze with cold, prismatic sparks. The light caught on the fine dust suspended in the motionless air, turning each mote into a fleeting star in the silent firmament of the hall. The shot glided past the empty hearths and the vacant, ornate benches, the sheer scale of the room amplifying its profound vacancy. The mirrors reflected only more emptiness, an endless regression of arched windows, frozen statuary, and gleaming floor, a labyrinth of captured light and void. The opulence was overwhelming, a deliberate assault of wealth and power, yet it was sterile, a stage set before the actors. Arrived, the air itself felt thin, chilled by the marble and glass, carrying only the faint, ghostly scent of old polish and stone. Finally, the movement ceased, the camera resting its gaze upon the spot before the central window. There stood a lone, draped podium, covered in rich fabric of imperial colors, deep, blood-like reds, heavy gold brocade, and severe blacks. It was a stark, focused point in the ocean of reflected grandeur. The windows behind it looked out onto the Versailles Gardens, geometrically perfect and slumbering under a flat, pale sky, the fountains still and silent. This was the appointed place, the focal point where history would be condensed into a single moment. The silence here was not peaceful, but profound and echoing, a vacuum waiting to be filled by a word that would reshape the continent. The monumental, vacant power of the hall held its breath, a glittering shell awaiting its kernel of meaning.